The worn velvet of my armchair has always been a comfort. It's molded to the shape of my body over the years, a small, quiet testament to a life lived in one place. I was tracing the familiar pattern of a faded flower on the fabric with my thumb, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, when the front door opened without a knock. It was Alexei. He moved through my small home like he was surveying a property he'd already purchased. His expensive shoes, Italian leather, I guessed from the sharp, clean sound they made on my wooden floors, seeming out of place against the humble rugs. He was dressed for a boardroom, not a father's living room. The suit was a deep, unforgiving charcoal, the tie a perfect tight knot. He smelled of expensive cologne and ambition, a scent that always made the air in my house feel thin. He didn't sit. He stood over me, blocking the light from the lamp, casting a long, cold shadow across my lap and the coffee table between us. On that table sat a small, chipped porcelain ashtray, a relic from a trip my late wife and I took to the Baltic coast a lifetime ago. It was the only thing of any sentimental value in the room. He placed a single sheet of paper on the table, right next to that ashtray. He didn't hand it to me. He slapped it down. The sound was flat, final, like a judge's gavel. "What is this, Alexei?" My voice was calm, the same tone I'd used to ask him if he'd finished his homework when he was a boy. He didn't smile. His eyes, the same shade of blue as his mother's, held none of her warmth. They were like chips of ice. "It's an invoice," he said, his voice devoid of any inflection. "A statement of debt." I leaned forward slowly, my joints protesting with a quiet ache. I picked up the paper. The words were formal, printed in a severe black font. It was a demand letter, the kind a lawyer sends. It stated that I, Viktor, owed the sum of $2 million to my son, Alexei. I read the number twice. 2 million. It was such an absurd figure, it almost didn't register. It was more money than I had seen in my entire life. I looked up at him, waiting for the punchline, for the smirk that would break this strange, cruel charade. It never came. "For what?" I asked, letting the paper fall back to the table. It landed softly, a stark contrast to how it had arrived. "For a lifetime of investment," he said, the words rolling off his tongue as if he'd rehearsed them. "For the opportunities I lost because I had a father with a mediocre career. For the connections I never had, the capital that was never provided. You raised me in this." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room with undisguised contempt. "This modest existence, it held me back. This is the repayment for that deficit mediocre." The word hung in the air between us, heavier than the demand for $2 million. All those years of quiet work, of providing a roof and food, of reading bedtime stories and fixing broken bicycles. All of it reduced to that single venomous word, mediocre. "You have 48 hours, he continued, his voice dropping into a low, business-like tone. "Transfer the funds to the account listed. If you do not, I will be forced to take more direct action. I will begin legal proceedings to seize this house to satisfy a portion of the debt. And I will make sure every one of your neighbors, every person you have ever known, understands the kind of man you truly are. A failure as a provider and a father. The humiliation will be comprehensive." He stood there for a moment longer, letting the threat settle into the quiet of the room, polluting the peace I had spent decades cultivating. He looked at me not as a son looks at his father, but as a predator looks at prey that is already cornered. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. The door clicked shut behind him, a sound as soft and definitive as a tomb ceiling. I sat there in the sudden, profound silence. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder now. I looked at the demand letter on the table, its stark whiteness a stain against the dark, worn wood. I looked at the chipped porcelain ashtray beside it. and for the first time in a very, very long time, I felt something other than quiet resignation. I felt the cold, sharp edge of an insult that had been delivered not in a fit of rage, but with the chilling precision of a business transaction. The morning after my son's visit, the world outside my kitchen window looked exactly the same. The same old oak tree cast the same long shadow across my lawn. The same sparrows bickered in the bird feeder. It was a kind of mockery, I thought, how life just carries on as if nothing has happened, as if a tectonic plate hasn't just shifted deep beneath the surface of your existence. I finished my tea, a simple black tea, no sugar, the way I've taken it for 50 years, and carried the empty cup to the sink. The ritual of washing it, of drying it with a faded checkered towel, of placing it back in the exact same spot in the cupboard, was a comfort. It was an anchor. My life is built on these small, predictable actions. They are the bricks and mortar of the quiet existence I have so carefully constructed. I stepped out into the backyard, the worn wooden planks of the deck warm under my bare feet. The air smelled of damp earth and the first blooms of my lilac bush. This garden is my sanctuary. It's a quarter acre of order in a world that feels increasingly chaotic. Every plant has its purpose. Every weed is an intruder to be plucked. I knelt by the tomato plants, my knees complaining softly, as they always do, and began inspecting the leaves. My fingers, thick and calloused now, traced the veins, searching for signs of blight or pests. There is a simple, honest logic to gardening. You put in the work, you tend to the needs of the soil and the plant, and you are rewarded. It is a transaction without betrayal. Mrs. Gable from next door waved from over the fence, her silver hair catching the sun. "Lovely morning, Viktor," she called out. "Indeed it is," I replied, offering the gentle, slightly weary smile she expects. That's how the neighborhood sees me. Viktor, the quiet, kind man, the widower. A little sad, perhaps, a little lonely. They see the man who tends his garden, who nods politely on his walks, who keeps to himself. They see the empty chair on my porch and assume it represents an empty life. They are not entirely wrong, but they have no idea what truly fills the silence. I was thinning the carrots when the phone rang inside the house. The sound was an intrusion, a sharp digital shriek in my world of rustling leaves and chirping birds. My hand stilled for a moment. For an irrational second, I thought it might be Alexei calling to reiterate his demand. The word felt foreign and ugly in my mind, a demand from my own son. I walked inside, wiping the soil from my hands onto my old trousers. The phone, an outdated cordless model, sat on the small table in the hallway. "Viktor," a familiar, calm voice said. "Dr. Petrov, I am just calling to remind you of your appointment tomorrow. 10 o'clock, just a routine checkup." The tension I hadn't even realized was coiling in my shoulders loosened its grip. "Thank you, Dmitri," I said, using his first name, a familiarity born of 30 years of him looking after my wife, and then just me. "I will be there." "Good, good. And how are you feeling? Any more of that dizziness?" "I am fine," I said, and the words felt true in that moment. In the garden, with the sun on my back and the smell of earth in my nose, I could almost believe it. Just the usual aches. "We will talk about it tomorrow. Get some blood work done. Take care of yourself, Viktor." The line went dead. The call was a thread of normalcy, a connection to the life I had before Alexei walked in and dropped a bomb on my coffee table. It was a quiet, mundane moment, a stark contrast to the chilling ultimatum of the previous evening. It reminded me that there was still a world where people asked how you were feeling and meant it, a world of routine checkups and friendly reminders. After hanging up, I stood for a long moment in the quiet hallway. My eyes drifted to the old mahogany chest of drawers that had been my wife's. It's a beautiful piece, scarred and polished by time. Without really thinking, my feet carried me toward it. I pulled open the bottom drawer, the one that sticks a little, filled with linens and old sweaters. Pushed to the very back, behind a stack of neatly folded woolens, was a small, simple wooden frame. I lifted it out. The glass was clean, I make a point of that. Inside the frame was a black and white photograph. It showed a young man who was, and yet wasn't, me. His posture was ramrod straight, his jaw set, his eyes holding a sharp, analytical coldness that seemed to look right through the camera lens. He wore a uniform, severe and unadorned, but it was not a soldier's uniform. It was something else, something for a role that didn't have a public name, a logistics and acquisitions specialist. The euphemism almost made me smile now. It was a picture of a man who saw the world as a series of interconnected systems, each with a critical weakness, a single point of failure, a man who knew how to apply pressure. I ran my thumb over the cool glass, tracing the line of that young man's shoulder. I had buried him for her, for our life, for the promise of peace. I had traded that sharp, dangerous clarity for the soft, forgiving blur of a quiet retirement. I had become the man in the garden, the kind, sad neighbor. I placed the photograph back in its hiding place, carefully rearranging the sweaters to conceal it once more. I closed the drawer, the soft thud, a final note in the morning's quiet symphony. The calm I knew was an illusion. It was the fragile surface of a pond, and beneath it, something old and patient was beginning to stir. But for now, there were still carrots to thin, and the sun was still warm. The morning after Alexei's visit, the world outside my window looked the same weak sun trying to burn through the morning fog, the same sparrows fighting over crumbs on my patio, but the air in my small house had changed. It was thick, heavy with the silence he'd left behind. I made my tea, the ritual the same, but my hands felt like they belonged to someone else. I kept expecting the echo of his voice, the slam of his car door. Instead, I got a different kind of announcement. It was the sound of an engine, too smooth and expensive for my street, idling just a little too long. I didn't need to look to know it wasn't a neighbor. A neighbor's car door slams. Their engine cuts. This one just purred, a low mechanical predator waiting at the edge of my vision. I finished my tea, washed the cup and dried it. Only then did I allow myself to walk to the front window and move the lace curtain aside, just a centimeter. A black sedan, so dark it seemed to drink the light, was parked directly across the street. Not tucked away, not trying to be discreet. It was a statement. The windows were tinted to an impenetrable black, but I could feel the weight of their gaze. 2 of them. I knew it without seeing. It's a feeling you don't forget. The specific pressure of being watched by professionals. They weren't here to deliver another message. They were the message. Alexei was showing me that his words weren't empty. He had resources. He had men who sat in dark cars and did nothing but wait. I let the curtain fall back into place. My heart wasn't hammering. It was beating a slow, cold and deliberate rhythm. This was no longer a family dispute. This was a siege. I went about my morning. I watered the geraniums on the porch, feeling their eyes on my back. I weeded a small patch of the vegetable garden, the soil cool and familiar under my fingers. I was performing normalcy, for them and for myself. A test of their patience, a test of my own composure. They didn't move. The car didn't leave. For 3 hours it was just me, the birds, and the silent watching car. Then around noon the phone rang. The first call was from Mrs. Gable, 2 houses down. Her voice was a nervous warble. "Viktor dear, I was just reading the local news blog, the community chatter, and oh, it's just awful what they're saying. Is everything all right? It says well, it says some terrible things about your finances and poor Alexei." I kept my voice even, a soft monotone. "Do not worry, Irina. It is just gossip. Thank you for your concern." I hung up before she could ask more. My hand was steady on the receiver, but a cold knot was tightening in my stomach. A blog. He was taking it public. The phone rang again 10 minutes later. Mr. Henderson from the corner house, his tone less concerned and more accusatory. "Viktor, saw a piece about you online. Always knew you were a bit tight with $1, but to do that to your own boy? A real shame." Click. Then another. And another. A concerned widow, a nosy retiree, a man whose lawnmower I'd fixed last summer. The phone became an instrument of torture, each ring a little hammer blow to the quiet life I had built. The story I gathered from their fragmented, shocked questions was a masterpiece of malicious fiction. It painted me as a secret gambler, a man who had frittered away a fortune that never existed, leaving my ambitious, hard-working son to struggle because of my financial incompetence and selfishness. It was all implication and twisted half-truths designed to paint me as a pathetic, failed man. It was humiliation as a tactic. I stopped answering. I just sat in my armchair, listening to it ring, watching the black car through the gap in the curtains. The two pressures mounted in tandem, the silent physical threat outside and the loud social destruction spreading through the telephone lines. My small, orderly living room, once my sanctuary, felt like a glass box. Everyone could see in. Everyone was talking. The four walls seemed to press closer, the air growing thinner. I looked at the photograph of my wife, Anna, on the mantelpiece. Her smile, once a source of warmth, now felt like a question. "What are you going to do?" The man in the black and white photo hidden in my drawer, the one with the sharp eyes and the cold certainty, he would have known what to do. But I had buried him for her, for this life, for the boy who was now using the very peace I had created for him as a weapon against me. The phone rang again, a shrill, insistent sound in the quiet house. I didn't move. I just watched the black car. The pressure was no longer just mounting, it was a physical weight on my chest. This was the escalation. This was Alexei turning the screws. And in the deep, quiet center of myself, beneath the performed calm and the practiced stillness, I felt the first, faint stirrings of something I had not felt in 30 years. Not anger, not fear. It was the cold, analytical click of a lock being opened. A door I had sealed shut was beginning to swing inward, and from the darkness within, the ghost of the man I used to be was starting to wake up. The waiting room was a study in muted tones. Beige walls, a faded green carpet, and chairs upholstered in a fabric designed to hide stains and discourage prolonged sitting. I focused on a cheaply framed print of a sailboat on a turbulent sea, trying to steady my own breathing. The air smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation. My body was here for Dr. Petrov, but my mind was back in my living room, staring at the ghost of my son's contemptuous sneer, feeling the phantom weight of that demand letter on my coffee table. $2 million, a lifetime of investment, he called it. The words felt like a physical blow, each one a separate insult. When the nurse called my name, I followed her with the practiced calm of a man used to compartmentalizing. The blood pressure cuff tightened on my arm, a familiar, impersonal pressure. Dr. Petrov entered with his usual gentle smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He'd been our family doctor for over 3 decades. He'd held my wife's hand during her final illness. He knew the contours of our lives, or so I had thought. "Viktor," he said, his voice a low, reassuring rumble. "How are we feeling?" "Fine, doctor," I lied, the word automatic. My pulse hammered against the cuff. He glanced at the monitor, then back at me, his smile fading into a look of professional concern. "Your blood pressure is quite elevated, more than your usual, and you look tense. Is everything all right?" I gave a non-committal shrug, a gesture meant to convey minor worries, the simple anxieties of an old man, but he'd seen me through too much. He saw the tightness in my jaw, the way my hands refused to rest completely still in my lap. He finished the physical part of the examination, listening to my heart, my lungs, all the while maintaining a thoughtful silence. As he made a note in my file, he spoke again, his tone shifting from clinical to deeply personal. "Viktor," he began, his voice dropping, laced with a sympathy that felt misplaced. "I heard a rumor through the neighborhood about Alexei." My head snapped up. Of course, the blog. The whispers had reached even here, this sterile sanctuary. Dr. Petrov misinterpreted my sharp reaction. He saw the stress, the deep weariness, and he connected it to the one secret he thought we shared. He leaned forward, his expression one of fatherly advice. "You shouldn't let him do this to you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the walls themselves might be listening. He placed a warm, comforting hand on my shoulder. "I know how much you loved Irina. We all did. And you were a saint to raise the boy as your own. But he is not even your blood." The world did not slow down. It did not stop. Instead, it seemed to crystallize, every detail becoming impossibly sharp and clear. The grain of the wood on his desk, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights, the scent of his soap. His words hung in the air between us, not as a shock, but as a key turning in a lock I never knew existed. "The secret I kept for you and your late wife for 35 years. He continued, mistaking my stunned silence for confirmation, for a shared burden finally acknowledged. "He doesn't obligate you to this, to his extortion. You have no biological tie to bind you. You are a free man, Viktor. You don't owe him anything. He is not even your blood." The words were not a wound. They were a surgeon's scalpel, performing a painless, precise excision. In that single breathtaking moment, a lifetime of emotional chains, heavy and rusted with duty and a father's love, simply fell away. The guilt I had felt for my supposed failures, the profound, aching hurt of his betrayal, the very foundation of my identity as his father, it all dissolved into nothing. I saw Irina's face, not in her final pained days, but in the radiant, anxious joy of her telling me she was pregnant. I remembered the fierce, protective love that had surged in me, a love so absolute I had never once questioned its origin. I had buried my past, my true self, for them, for her, and for the child I believed was ours. And now I knew the child was hers, only hers. Dr. Petrov was still talking, offering more consolation, but his voice was a distant murmur. The click was deafening. It was the sound of a final barrier breaking. All the patience, all the turning of the other cheek, all the willingness to absorb the insults for the sake of family. It was predicated on a lie. A beautiful, well-intentioned lie, but a lie nonetheless. Alexei was not my son. The last tether of sentiment, the final thread that had held my hands back, was severed. The injustice was no longer a family dispute. It was a strategic problem presented by a hostile entity, and strategic problems were something I knew how to solve. I looked at Dr. Petrov, and I managed a small, tight smile. "Thank you, doctor," I said, my voice remarkably steady. "You have no idea how much you've helped me today." And I meant it. He had not given me a diagnosis. He had given me a weapon. He had handed me my own freedom, and in doing so, he had just signed Alexei's ruin. The quiet, aging man sitting in that examination room was gone. In his place was the ghost of the logistics and acquisitions specialist, and he had just been given his target. The silence in my study was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered the last echoes of the doctor's words. "He is not even your blood." They should have been a shock, a seismic event that shattered my world. But they weren't. They were a key, turning a lock I hadn't realized was there. opening a door to a part of myself I had sealed away a lifetime ago. My eyes fell upon the old silver-framed photograph on the desk. I didn't need to pick it up. I knew every grainy detail. A young man, lean and sharp, with eyes that held no warmth, only a calculating stillness. The uniform was generic, nondescript, but those in the know would recognize the subtle insignia. They called us logistics and acquisitions specialists, a beautifully bland title for what we really did. We weren't soldiers. We were architects of ruin. My specialty was structural analysis, not of buildings, but of systems. A supply chain, a corporate hierarchy, a man's entire life. To me, they were all just structures. And every structure, no matter how formidable it appears, has a single critical point of failure. One brick, if removed with precision, that causes the entire wall to tumble down. My job was to find that brick. I loved finding it. There was a cold, pure art to it. I would spend weeks, sometimes months, studying a target, not just their finances, but their habits, their vices, their relationships, their secret shames. I would map their entire existence like a blueprint. And then I would apply pressure. Not a sledgehammer, never that. A precisely calibrated tap in exactly the right place. A whispered rumor to the right person. A lost document in a rival's inbox. A minor, inexplicable delay in a critical shipment. From the outside it looked like a cascade of bad luck, a series of unfortunate coincidences. From my chair it was a symphony of collapse. And I was the conductor. Then I met Anya. She was sunlight piercing a world of perpetual twilight. She saw the haunted look in my eyes, and instead of turning away, she reached for me. She made me believe in a different kind of life. A life of peace, of quiet mornings and a small garden. When she told me she was pregnant and that the child wasn't mine, it didn't matter. Nothing from my old life mattered. I buried that man in the photograph deeper than any grave. I agreed to raise the boy as my own, to give him the normal, stable childhood I never had. For Anya, I would have done anything. For 35 years, I pruned roses and fixed leaky faucets. I became Viktor, the quiet, kindly neighbor, a man of simple means and simpler pleasures, a ghost. And now that ghost was being summoned back. The peace was gone, shattered by a boy I had raised, a boy who shared none of my blood, demanding a ransom for a life I had freely given him. The insult wasn't the money, it was the sheer clumsy brutality of it, the lack of finesse. He thought power was a dark car and a threat. He had no idea what real power looked like. So I sat there in the deepening quiet of my study, and I began to do what I was born to do. I began to analyze the structure. Alexei's life, his new business, the sudden wealth, the expensive suits that cost more than my first car. It was too fast, too flashy. It screamed of front operations, of money that needed to be cleaned. He was a middleman, a useful idiot for someone far more powerful, some oligarch who needed a pliable, presentable face for his dirty work. His backers. They were his strength, but also his greatest vulnerability. Men like that are built on paranoia and betrayal. They trust no one. The slightest suggestion that their trusted lieutenant is skimming funds, or worse, talking to a rival, would turn them from patrons into predators in a heartbeat. His lifestyle, the penthouse, the sports car, the Instagram posts from exclusive clubs. It was a facade, a house of cards built on a foundation of lies and other people's money. He was leveraged to the hilt, emotionally and financially. He needed the constant influx of cash, the appearance of success, to maintain the illusion. He had no core, no substance. He was all surface. A plan began to form in my mind, not as a burst of inspiration, but as a series of cold, logical steps falling into place like the tumblers of a lock. It would not be a war of attrition. It would not be a messy, emotional confrontation. It would be a demolition, I would not lay a hand on him. I would not raise my voice. I would find the single critical point of failure in the gaudy, unstable structure he called his life, and I would apply the most precise pressure imaginable. I would make his world collapse from the inside out. I would turn his allies against him, freeze his assets, and shred his reputation, all from this quiet room. I would use the very system he was exploiting to devour him whole. The man in the photograph stared back at me from the desk. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a tool I had reluctantly but decisively picked up again. The gardener was putting away his trowel. The structural analyst was going back to work. The click of the lock on my study door was the sound of a past life opening up. For 35 years, I had kept it sealed shut, a vault of skills and memories I'd promised my wife I would never again touch. But the boy, no, the man, Alexei, had broken the seal. He had mistaken my silence for weakness, my peace for poverty. He thought he was dealing with a sad old gardener. He was about to learn he was dealing with a ghost. The first step was reconnaissance. Alexei's world was a house of cards, and my profession back in the day was to find the single card that, if removed, would cause the entire structure to fall. I didn't need muscle, I needed information. I sat at my old solid oak desk, the computer screen glowing in the dim light. The modern world has its own obscure bureaucratic channels, digital ones, but the principles are the same as the paper-filled offices of my youth. It's all about knowing which doors are unlocked and which officials can be persuaded. Not with threats, but with a shared understanding of how the world truly works. I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a man I hadn't spoken to in over 2 decades. There was no greeting, no small talk. I gave him a name, Alexei's name, and a single codified phrase we had used long ago. It meant, find the foundation, find the weakness. He understood. He was silent for a moment, and then he simply said, it will be done. The call lasted 11 seconds. The second call was to a woman, a former archivist, whose life I had once quietly saved. Her memory was a library of favors owed. I asked her for a specific set of public records, the kind that are technically available but buried under mountains of digital red tape. She knew how to navigate it. Within an hour, a secure file began populating my screen. Piece by piece, the picture formed. Alexei's import-export business was a child's sketch. The shipments were phantom, the invoices were fiction. The money flowing through his accounts was not from trade, but from washing. He was a small, greedy spigot for a much larger, powerful oligarch, a man named Gregor Zima, a vulture who had grown fat on the carcass of the old state. Alexei was his useful idiot, living a lavish life and thinking himself a king. He didn't realize he was just a disposable piece on a much larger board. I had his weakness. He was entirely dependent on Zima's patronage and the illusion of his own legitimacy. Step 2 was the lever. I would not push the house over myself. I would make it look like Alexei was kicking out the supports from the inside. I spent the next 6 hours in a state of pure, focused concentration. I crafted a narrative. Using the documents I had acquired, I created a dossier. But I didn't just present the facts. I framed them. I wrote a cover letter from the perspective of a disgruntled, paranoid junior partner, a fictional character I invented, accusing Alexei of skimming from the top, of planning to cut his own deal with a rival, of being a traitor to Zima's organization. The evidence was real, but the context was a masterful lie. I then chose my messengers with care. The dossier went to 2 places. The first was the inbox of an independent investigative journalist, a bulldog with a reputation for integrity and a deep-seated hatred for men like Zima. For her, it was a golden ticket, a story of corruption and betrayal. The second copy went through a much more convoluted, encrypted route, designed to look like it had been clumsily intercepted and landed in the hands of Zima's most bitter rival, For him, it was an opportunity, a gift-wrapped excuse to move against his enemy with what appeared to be insider information. I sent them. 2 clicks and the seeds of ruin were sown. Alexei would now have 2 powerful forces converging on him, the relentless light of public exposure and the dark, vengeful shadow of a betrayed oligarch. But sometimes a system needs a physical shock to truly begin its collapse, a little nudge for the authorities. Step 3. I knew of a property Alexei used as a primary warehouse for his operations. It was a nondescript building on the industrial outskirts of the city. I had driven past it once, months ago, out of a faint, lingering paternal curiosity. My old training had kicked in automatically. I had noted the age of the structure, the type of gas lines feeding it, the poor state of its electrical panels. A structural analyst always finds the crack. I didn't need to be there. I needed a phone and a knowledge of city maintenance schedules. I called the non-emergency line for the fire department, my voice aged and slightly shaky. I reported a strong smell of gas coming from the alley behind that specific address. I mentioned I was a delivery driver who had just passed by. Then I hung up. They would send a truck. It was protocol, and when they arrived, they would find a very minor, very plausible gas leak from an old corroded valve. A small contained incident, but their investigation would not stop there. They would have to enter the building to ensure it was safe. And when they did, they would find more than just faulty plumbing. They would find the stacks of false ledgers, the empty boxes that were supposed to contain high-value electronics, the safe in the back office that shouldn't be there. It would pique their interest. They would call the police. The police would call financial crimes. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the machine was in motion. The journalist was verifying her story. The rival oligarch was mobilizing his resources, and the local authorities were now officially sniffing around Alexei's most important location. I sat back in my chair, the first light of dawn filtering through the window. I felt no triumph, no joy, only the cold, clean satisfaction of a problem solved. The system he had built was not under attack. It was simply falling apart, all on its own, because I had shown everyone where the cracks were. The countermove was complete. Now all that was left was to wait for the collapse. The front door didn't slam. It whispered open and then clicked shut with a soft, final sound. He was always so dramatic, my Alexei. Even now, in the middle of his own personal apocalypse, he had to make an entrance. I heard his frantic breathing before I saw him, the ragged, panicked gasps of a drowning man. He stood in the doorway of my living room, his expensive suit rumpled, his hair a mess. His face was a pale, sweaty mask of pure, undiluted terror. The scent of his fear was sharp, almost metallic in the quiet air of my home. He looked like a ghost who had just seen the devil. I was sitting in my armchair, the same one I'd been in when he'd slapped that demand letter on the table. The same coffee table was between us, but this time the power had shifted. It was no longer a chasm between us. It was a witness stand. "You," he choked out, pointing a trembling finger at me. This is you. This has to be you. It's some kind of stupid senile luck." I didn't move. I just watched him. I let him have his moment, this last desperate performance. I saw the flicker of his eyes, taking in the room, looking for some sign, some clue that this was all a bizarre coincidence. He was still trying to fit me into the narrative he'd built in his head. The weak, mediocre old man, the easy target. "My accounts are frozen," he spat, the words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "The police are at my office. My partners. They won't take my calls. They're saying I betrayed them. They think I talked. Everything is gone. How? How did this happen?" He was begging for an explanation, but he was asking the wrong questions. He was still focused on the how, the mechanics of the collapse. He hadn't yet considered the who. The who was sitting right in front of him, and he was blind to it. I took a slow, deliberate sip from the glass of water on the table beside me. The silence in the room stretched, growing heavier and more profound. With every second his panic echoed unanswered. I let him drown in the quiet. I let him feel the full, crushing weight of the void where his empire used to be. Finally I spoke. My voice was calm. It wasn't the quiet of weakness he was used to. It was the calm of absolute certainty, the calm of a surgeon after a successful operation. "Sit down, Alexei." He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. The command in my tone was so foreign, so utterly unexpected that for a moment he seemed to forget how to breathe. He didn't sit. I said, "Sit down." This time it was not a suggestion. It was the voice of the man in the old hidden photograph, the voice of the logistics and acquisitions specialist. He flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible jerk of his shoulders, and then he slowly, awkwardly, lowered himself onto the edge of the sofa opposite me. He looked like a scolded child. I looked at him then, not at the expensive suit, or the manicured hands, or the face twisted in fury. I looked past all of that, at the core of the man, and for the first time I didn't see my son. I saw a stranger, a flawed, greedy, and profoundly foolish stranger. "You came here demanding an explanation," I began, my gaze steady on his. "You think this is luck. You think the universe has simply turned against you. You are wrong. The universe is indifferent. I, however, am not." I leaned forward just a little and saw him shrink back. The predator in him sensed the true predator in me, finally awake after a long sleep. "There are two things you need to understand," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing him to lean in to hear, making him a participant in his own downfall. "The first is that I know. I have known for a little while now. Dr. Petrov, in his concern for my health, let a 35-year-old secret slip. I know you are not my son." The color drained from his face completely. It was a different kind of shock than the financial ruin. This was an existential one. The very foundation of his identity, the leverage he thought he held over me, the unpayable debt of fatherhood, evaporated in an instant. His mouth worked, but no sound came out. "The second thing," I continued, not giving him a moment to recover, "is that you have just discovered, in the most practical way possible, what I used to do for a living. You thought I was a paper pusher, a mediocre bureaucrat. You were looking at the cover of the book, Alexei. You never bothered to read the title." I gestured vaguely around the quiet, simple room. "This life, this peace, it was a choice. A promise I made to your mother. I buried who I was to give her, and you, a normal life. My work was not in combat. It was in structural analysis. I was a specialist in finding the single point of failure in any system. A business, a government. A man I could see the pieces starting to click into place in his mind, each one landing with a dull, terrible thud. His new business, his powerful backers, the oligarch, the money laundering. "I did not break your little empire, Alexei," I said, and I allowed a faint, cold smile to touch my lips. It wasn't a smile of joy, but of professional satisfaction, a job well done. I did not have to. You built it on rotten foundations. You aligned yourself with ruthless men who see loyalty as a transaction. You created a financial house of cards, all flesh and no substance. All I did was find the weakest card, the one you thought was hidden, and I pulled it." The realization dawned on his face. It was a slow, horrifying sunrise. The frantic panic in his eyes was replaced by a dawning, gut-wrenching horror. He wasn't looking at a victim anymore. He was looking at the architect. He had threatened a quiet old man, and in doing so he had awakened the ghost who had built the very ground he was standing on, only to show him that it was hollow. "You," he whispered, the word a breath of utter defeat. "Me," I confirmed softly. I simply showed everyone where the cracks already were. Your partners, your rivals, the police. They did the rest. You were the author of your own ruin, Alexei. I was merely the editor. He didn't get up. He didn't shout. He just sat there, collapsing in on himself, the final terrible understanding settling into his bones. The quiet old man in the armchair hadn't been lucky. He had been waiting, and his wait was over. The silence in my living room was different now. It wasn't the heavy, waiting silence of those 48 hours when I could feel the pressure building like a storm. It wasn't the brittle silence after Alexei had stormed out, leaving the echo of his threats hanging in the air. This was a deep, clean silence, the kind that settles after a long illness has finally broken. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant chirp of a bird in my garden, ordinary sounds that had been drowned out for weeks by the pounding of my own heart. The men in the dark cars were gone. I'd watched them leave 2 days prior, not in a dramatic screech of tires, but with a quiet, almost sheepish efficiency. Their purpose had evaporated. The show of force they represented was now meaningless, a prop for a play that had closed on opening night. The space in front of my house was just a street again, not a stage for intimidation. My phone rang, shattering the quiet. For a moment my body tensed, an old conditioned response, but the number was unfamiliar, not Alexei's. I picked it up. "Is this Viktor?" a young, eager voice asked. It was the journalist, Anya, from the independent outlet I'd anonymously fed the documents to. Her voice was buzzing with the energy of a career-making story. "I was hoping to get a comment from you regarding the source of the information that led to Alexei Volkov's arrest. There's talk of a mysterious benefactor. Some are calling it an inside job, a betrayal from within his own organization. Do you have any insight?" I looked around my quiet living room, at the worn armchair, the simple bookshelf, the faded rug. This was the home of a deadbeat father, a mediocre man, according to the story Alexei had tried to build around me. He never understood that the most powerful structures are often the ones you cannot see. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice even and calm. "I have no insight to offer. I am just an old man who tends his garden." There was a pause on the other end. I could almost hear her journalist's mind whirring, trying to decode my flat tone, searching for a hidden meaning. "Are you sure?" There's a sense that someone with significant understanding of financial systems and corporate structures orchestrated this. The precision was remarkable. I almost smiled. Structural analysis. That's what we called it. Finding the single point of failure. In Alexei's case, it wasn't a vault or a security system. It was his own greed, his need to be seen as powerful by men who were truly powerful. I didn't create the cracks in his foundation. I simply applied the precise amount of pressure to the one he had already dug himself, his connection to the oligarch. I showed the rival where to push. I guided the journalist to the documents that were already there, just buried under layers of obfuscation. I staged the small suspicious incident that would draw the right kind of official attention, the kind that doesn't look away when offered a bribe. "It sounds like justice was simply served," I said to the journalist. "Sometimes corrupt things just fall apart." I politely ended the call and placed the phone back on its cradle. The silence returned, but it was welcome now. It was mine. I walked to the window and looked out at my garden. The tomatoes were coming in nicely. The simple physical act of tending to them these past weeks had been my anchor. It was real. The soil, the sun, the growth, these were things that could not be manipulated or threatened. They followed their own inherent logic. I thought of Alexei, not with anger but with a distant clinical pity. His arrest had been all over the news. The headlines were brutal. Rising star's empire built on lies. Volkov arrest exposes vast laundering scheme. His name, the reputation he valued above all else, was now a synonym for corruption and failure. The $2 million he demanded from me were now frozen in accounts seized by the state. The house he threatened to take was still mine. The peace he tried to steal was, ironically, now more profound than ever. He had seen my quiet life as weakness. He mistook my retirement for retreat. He never understood that I had chosen this simplicity, that I had fought for it, that I had buried a part of myself I was entirely capable of resurrecting to protect it. He thought he was the predator, and I was the prey. He never considered that the rabbit hole he was threatening to drag me into was a warren I had designed. Sitting back down in my chair, I let out a long, slow breath. It was over. The ghost of my past had been summoned, had done its work with a cold, efficient skill I remembered, and was now laid to rest again. The false family, the obligation built on a secret I had cherished for 35 years, was gone. The structure of that life had collapsed, but I was not buried in the rubble. I was standing in the clear space it left behind, finally, completely free. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was the sound of a battle ended, and it was peaceful. The silence in this new apartment has a different quality to it. It's not the heavy, waiting silence of the old house, a quiet that was filled with the ghosts of a life I thought I had. This silence is clean. It's mine. I look out the window, not at a garden I meticulously tended out of a sense of duty, but at a cityscape, a living, breathing entity of steel and light. This is the 7th floor, a good height. It offers perspective. The money arrived as I knew it would, not in a dramatic wire transfer, but through a series of labyrinthine channels that felt like a familiar, if dusty, old language. A consultant's fee, the attached note had read, from a corporate entity that doesn't technically exist. The oligarch, the one whose rival I so helpfully destabilized, is a man who understands the value of a job well done, and more importantly, the danger of leaving a loose end like me unpaid. He paid not out of gratitude, but out of professional courtesy and self-preservation. I used it to secure this place. It's slightly nicer, as I said, solid floors that don't creak with the weight of old memories. A modern kitchen where I can brew my tea without the scent of 30 years of shared meals clinging to the walls. But it is still modest. Extravagance is a flag, and I have no interest in flying any flags ever again. The movers were confused. I had so little to bring: clothes, a few books, my tea set, and the photograph. It sits on my new desk now, not hidden in a drawer. The young man in the uniform with the sharp analytical eyes stares back at me from across the decades. I don't see a ghost there anymore. I see a version of myself that was simply dormant. He is not a source of shame or a secret to be buried. He is a reminder of capability. We have reached an understanding, he and I. My new circle of friends. That's an interesting development. I didn't seek them out. Men like us rarely do. We simply recognize one another. There's a certain stillness in the eyes, a way of observing a room before entering it, a particular economy of movement and speech. We meet sometimes, not at a loud bar, but at a quiet chess pavilion in the park, or a specific cafe that knows to leave us alone. We are a collection of retired librarians, former accountants, one who claims to have been a long-haul truck driver. The titles are meaningless. We are men who once understood systems, who knew how things worked in the shadows, and have now chosen the light. We speak of books, of the weather, of the frustrating complexity of modern television remotes. We never speak of the past. We don't need to. The understanding is there, a silent current flowing between us. In their company, I am not a victim nor an avenger. I am just Viktor. Occasionally, a story will flicker across the news on the television I seldom watch. A follow-up piece on the downfall of a mid-level financial criminal, His assets seized, his name a byword for corruption and incompetence. I feel nothing when I see his face. No anger, no triumph, not even pity. It is like watching a weather report for a city I no longer live in. The storm there is of no consequence to me. He made his choices, I made mine. The ledger is balanced, the door is closed. My peace is not the absence of noise, but the presence of order. My life is my own. Every decision from the brand of coffee I buy to the time I wake up is mine alone. There is a profound, almost spiritual simplicity in that. The great lie that defined my adult life, the paternity, the sacrifice, the performance of being a certain kind of man, has been burned away. What remains is the essential truth of who I always was. I am tending to a small bonsai tree on my balcony now, a complex living system. It requires patience, a deep understanding of its structure, and the precise application of pressure at exactly the right points to guide its growth. It is a satisfying hobby. It reminds me that control is not about force. It is about understanding, about working with the inherent nature of a thing. The phone rang earlier. It was Dr. Petrov, just checking in. He sounded relieved. He said, I sounded, well, I am. We spoke for a few minutes about nothing of importance, and then we said our goodbyes. There were no secrets between us anymore, no unspoken truths straining the conversation. It was just two old men talking. As the sun sets, painting the glass and steel of the city in hues of orange and deep blue, I sit in my chair. The silence is a companion. The past is a closed book. The future is a blank page, and for the first time in a very, very long time, I find I am looking forward to writing on it. I am, in every sense of the word that matters, free. Looking into this camera, I see more than just a lens. I see faces, people trying to make their way in a world that often feels like it rewards the loudest voice, the sharpest elbow, the most ruthless ambition. You followed my story. You saw the quiet man, the garden, the simple life. You probably thought, like my son did, that this was all there was, that a man's worth is measured by the noise he makes or the wealth he displays. Let me tell you a different truth. There's an old saying, a lion does not concern himself with the opinions of sheep. For most of my life, I lived by that. I tended my garden, I cherished my peace, I let the world think what it wanted. But that saying isn't the whole story. Sometimes a jackal in sheep's clothing needs to be reminded what a lion's roar truly sounds like. And I need you to understand something crucial about that roar. It is not always loud. It is not the explosive, chaotic anger that destroys everything in its path. That is the sound of fear. That is the sound of a creature who has lost control. A true lion's roar is different. It is precise. It is the silent, calculated pressure applied to the single weakest point in a structure. It is the quiet, almost imperceptible sound of a foundation giving way. Sometimes the most powerful roar is the silent collapse of a house built on lies. You don't need to scream to be heard. You just need to know exactly where to push. My son, the boy I raised, the man who threatened me, he believed respect was something you could demand. You put on an expensive suit, you park dark cars outside a house, you make threats, you shout. You think that force and fear are the same thing as power. They are not. Power is knowledge. Power is patience. Power is understanding the geometry of a situation so completely that the slightest nudge from you can topple an empire. Respect is not demanded. It is earned. And sometimes it is quietly, irrevocably enforced. He built his entire life on a foundation of deception, on laundered money, on false loyalties, on the belief that the man he called father was too weak, too simple to see the cracks in his perfect world. All I did was show everyone else what was already there. I didn't break his empire. I just removed the illusion that it was ever strong to begin with. And that leads me to the final, heaviest truth. Some secrets are better left buried. For 35 years, I carried the secret of his parentage. I carried it for the love of a woman, for the hope of a family, for the dream of a peaceful life. It was a weight I chose to bear. But when that secret was unearthed, it did not bring clarity. It brought a weapon. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the one that showed me the absolute moral emptiness of the fight I was in. It freed me from any last shred of obligation. But not all secrets are like that. Some are meant to stay in the ground. Some truths, when dragged into the light, only serve to destroy, not to heal. Wisdom isn't just knowing the truth, it's knowing what to do with it. It's knowing when to speak and when to let silence do the talking. So what is the moral of this story? It is not that you should hide who you are. It is that you should never mistake a quiet nature for a weak one. It is that your past, no matter how deeply you bury it, has given you skills. It has given you a unique way of seeing the world. Do not ever let anyone make you feel small for the life you have chosen to live in the present. That choice is your strength. The world is full of jackals pretending to be lions. They are loud. They are flashy. They demand your attention and your fear. But you can be the quiet one, the one who tends his garden, the one who watches, the one who understands that true strength isn't about making the most noise. It's about knowing with absolute certainty that you can win the war without ever firing a single loud shot. My peace was taken from me, so I took it back. Not with a shout, but with a whisper that brought down a house of cards. Remember that. If you found a sense of justice in this story, if it reminded you that the quiet man should never be underestimated, then hit that like button. If you want to see more tales, where the underdog uses his wits and not just his fists to find justice, then subscribe. There are more stories to tell, and I am just getting started.